The hymn was still playing when the second cascade alarm fired. I had been running the broadcast for 11 minutes. The lament of Anthari Vel, a funeral rite older than our station, older than the convocation itself, and the atmospheric processor in Bay 16 had just reported a pressure anomaly that I had already flagged, already routed to maintenance, already marked as non-critical in my daily log. That was 11 minutes ago. Now the cascade alarm was screaming through the overhead speakers in a pitch I had never heard the system produce, and the hymn was still playing because I had not turned it off, and 341 colonists on Rithara station were breathing air that had started to poison them 6 minutes before anyone noticed. I am Seville Kath. I was the broadcast chaplain for Rithara station, Convocation Frontier Division. My job was to run the hymn cycles, maintain the chapel band transmitters, and file the weekly frequency use logs with the Convocation Signal Authority on Solith Prime. I played hymns. I logged frequencies. I maintained the transmitters. I was not trained for atmospheric emergencies or evacuation coordination or crisis communication or anything that involved keeping living people alive. I was trained to broadcast prayers for the dead and the lost, on frequencies so old that the Convocation's own archives had reclassified them as ceremonial relics. The transmitters are the reason all of this happened. Station Commander Doroth Vennies was already in the operations center when the cascade alarm hit, and I know this because I heard her voice on the command channel. Steady, procedural, measured. The voice of a woman who had managed a frontier mining colony for 9 years without losing a single colonist. She issued the standard atmospheric failure sequence. Seal the outer ring, activate backup scrubbers in all secondary bays, route emergency ventilation through the agricultural galleries, where the plant systems were still cycling marginal oxygen through their growth beds. She gave the orders cleanly, without hesitation, in the exact cadence prescribed by the Convocation's Emergency Response Manual. But the backup scrubbers had been offline for 3 days. A shipment of replacement filter cartridges was aboard the CFS Velen Ark, a standard Convocation supply hauler, still 14 hours away at standard transit speed. The requisition had been filed 6 weeks earlier. It had been approved 4 weeks ago. The hauler had been delayed twice by scheduling conflicts at the Convocation's regional logistics hub, which services 43 frontier stations in our sector and is perpetually behind. And the cascade, a chain failure that originated in Bay 16's primary atmospheric processor and jumped to Bays 12 through 20 within 4 minutes, as the pressure differential pulled contaminated atmosphere through connecting ducts and overwhelmed the secondary filters in each successive bay, was degrading our breathable air faster than the remaining functional processors could replenish it. Vennies said, on the command channel, in a voice I will carry with me for the precise way it refused to shake, "We have approximately 90 minutes of viable atmosphere in the populated ring at current degradation rates. The backup scrubber system is non-functional. I am requesting emergency assistance from the Convocation Frontier Authority." She sent the request on the Convocation Standard Emergency Band, a Priority 1 distress packet addressed to the Frontier Authority's Regional Response Center, properly formatted, properly authenticated, with all required data fields completed. Vennies did not make formatting errors. The Convocation Frontier Authority acknowledged receipt within 2 minutes. They informed her that the nearest emergency-rated vessel was the CFS Peller Strand, a crisis response cruiser with atmospheric rescue capability, currently stationed at the Solith anchorage, 11 hours away at maximum speed. 90 minutes of breathable air, 11 hours to help. That is the arithmetic that should have ended us. I stood in the chapel band room and heard those numbers through the command channel, and I performed the calculation that everyone on the station was performing at the same moment. The simple, terrible subtraction that tells you whether the people you live with are going to survive. 90 minutes subtracted from 11 hours leaves a gap so wide that no amount of rationing or conservation or desperate improvisation can bridge it. The gap is not a problem to be solved. It is a fact. A flat, mathematical fact that sits in the center of your chest and does not move. The cascade was still progressing. I could hear it in the ventilation, a subtle change in the air quality, not yet dangerous but trending, a faint chemical sharpness at the back of the throat that meant the CO2 concentration was climbing. In the residential ring, the colonists were beginning to notice. I heard children coughing through the walls. I heard someone, a woman, her voice tight with controlled fear, asking a maintenance worker whether the air recyclers in Section 4 were functioning. They were not. I was in the chapel band room when Venny's transmitted the request, because the chapel band room is where I work, and because I had been trying to shut down the funeral hymn broadcast without corrupting the frequency log. The log was mid-cycle. And interrupting a hymn broadcast during an active cycle required a specific shutdown sequence that I was performing by memory because the procedure manual was in a cabinet on the far side of the room, and the alarm was very loud, and I was not thinking clearly. The chapel band transmitters on Rithara Station are old, pre-Reformation equipment, installed 63 years ago when the station was first constructed as a frontier mining outpost. They broadcast on a set of frequencies that the Convocation Signal Authority classified as deprecated 17 years before I was born, frequencies that were once used for long-range spiritual communication between frontier chaplains and colony ships that were months away from the nearest relay. Frequencies powerful enough to push a signal across vast distances, because the people who built them believed that prayers for the dead should reach as far as possible. Nobody uses those frequencies anymore except chaplains. Nobody listens to them. Nobody monitors them. They are ceremonial bandwidth, allocated out of tradition, maintained out of inertia, broadcast into the void because the rights say to broadcast and nobody has written a new right that says to stop. But the chapel band transmitters broadcast. That is what they were built to do. They push a signal into the dark, on frequencies that nobody monitors, to recipients that nobody expects to answer. I did not know, until that day, that the chapel band frequencies overlap with a set of emergency monitoring bands maintained by the Terran Commonwealth. I did not know that the overlap was documented in a technical footnote in the Convocation Signal Authority's Master Frequency Allocation Manual, page 1143, subsection 9, paragraph 4. A footnote first entered 41 years ago and never reviewed, never flagged, never communicated to any chaplain or station commander or frontier operator in the Convocation service. I did not know that a species I could barely name had been passively monitoring those frequencies for 4 decades, picking up our funeral hymns as background bleed on their emergency bandwidth, cataloging them, filing them, and continuing to listen. I know all of this now. The Convocation investigators explained it to me in detail, 7 weeks after the fact, in a conference room on Solith Prime, in a tone that suggested I should have read the manual more carefully. What I knew at the time was this: 90 minutes was not enough. The Convocation's nearest ship was 11 hours away. 341 people, miners, technicians, agricultural workers, families, children, 1 retired chaplain, were breathing air that was turning toxic. And I was standing in front of the only piece of equipment in my room that could transmit. A chapel band array designed 63 years ago by engineers who believed frontier chaplains needed to reach colony ships at interstellar distances. So I did what I was trained to do, not well, not correctly, not by any standard that the Signal Authority would later recognize as acceptable, but I did it. I composed a broadcast. Not a hymn, a distress call. I had never written one. The format I used was the standard Convocation emergency broadcast template, which I had encountered once in basic orientation training 8 years earlier, and which I reconstructed from memory with at least 3 formatting errors: wrong field order for the population count, non-standard labels for the atmospheric composition data, and an incorrect timestamp format that the investigators later described as creative. I entered the station's coordinates manually. I entered the atmospheric failure parameters: cascade type, progression rate, time to critical threshold. I entered the population count, 341, in a field that was supposed to contain the station's registration number. I entered everything I could think of in the wrong order with non-standard field labels. Because I am a chaplain and not a communications officer, and the alarm was screaming and the clock was counting down. And I broadcasted on every frequency the chapel band transmitters could reach. Every frequency, all of them, the active convocation channels that were already carrying Venice's properly formatted distress packet, the deprecated pre-Reformation bands that had not carried a non-hymn signal in decades, the test frequencies that had not been tested since before I was assigned to the station, the hymn cycle carriers, the dead channels that had been allocated 63 years ago and had never carried a single signal of any kind. I opened every transmission port the chapel band array had and pushed my distress call through all of them simultaneously, because I did not know which one still functioned, and I did not have time to find out, and I did not care at that moment about frequency use regulations or broadcast authorization or the signal authorities' filing requirements. The active convocation channels carried my signal to the same frontier authority that had already told us help was 11 hours away. The deprecated bands carried it into what I assumed was silence. The test frequencies carried it to receivers I did not know existed. And channel 7741, a hymn carrier that had been broadcasting funeral rites into the void for 63 years without receiving a single response, carried my distress call across a frequency overlap and into Terran Commonwealth Emergency Monitoring Band 7. I did not aim it at them. I did not know they were there. I did not know that they maintained a passive monitoring station on a research platform called Arden Point, 37 light minutes from Rithara Station, staffed by 4 people whose professional purpose was to listen to everything on every band in their coverage zone and respond to anything that carried the signature of someone dying. The signal I transmitted was a convocation funeral hymn frequency carrying a badly formatted distress call with 3 clerical errors, non-standard field labels, and a population count in the wrong date of field. It was not addressed to the Terran Commonwealth. It was not addressed to anyone. It was a frontier chaplain pushing every button he could find because 341 people were running out of air, and he did not know what else to do. The Terran Commonwealth heard it in 4 minutes. The signal propagation delay at 37 light minutes was approximately 4 minutes. They heard my prayer for help as soon as physics permitted. I did not know this at the time. What I knew was that Venice had ordered the populated ring sealed into pressure sections, 6 separate zones, each with its own emergency atmosphere reserve, to slow the degradation pattern and buy time. The colonists were being moved to the agricultural galleries in the station's central hub, where the plant growth beds were still producing marginal oxygen through their photosynthetic cycles. It was not enough oxygen for 341 people. It was not enough for 100. But it was more than the outer ring was producing, and Venice was buying minutes wherever she could find them. The operation status feed, visible on every terminal in the station, showed the countdown: 71 minutes. I left the chapel band room and went to help with the evacuation. I am not a large person. I am not trained in emergency transport or medical response or crowd management. But I can carry a child, and there were children in the outer residential ring who needed to be moved to the agricultural galleries before the air in their sections became unbreathable. I carried 3 of them on my first trip. Miri Voss, 4 years old, who clung to my chaplain's robe with both hands and pressed her face against my chest and did not cry. Her brother Talon, 6, who cried quietly into my shoulder the entire way, his tears warm against my neck. And an infant, I would learn later that her name was Kesadaroth, whose mother had collapsed in the corridor from early-stage carbon dioxide symptoms, and who was being held by a neighbor, a mining foreman named Urith Palani, who had 3 children of his own to move and could not carry a 4th. I made that trip twice. A maintenance worker named Osh Pelari, a man built like a loading crane, carried children 2 at a time at a full run, his boots pounding the deck plates, and made the trip 3 times before Venice ordered the residential ring sealed. He carried 6 children and came back for a 7th, a boy who had hidden under a bed, and who Pelari found by calling his name through the sealed section's emergency intercom until the boy answered. Venice herself carried 2, one under each arm, while issuing evacuation orders on the command channel without breaking her stride or her sentence structure. I watched her navigate a pressurized corridor junction, stepping over a cracked ventilation grate, turning sideways through a maintenance hatch, with a toddler gripping her uniform collar and a second child tucked against her side. And I thought, with a clarity that crisis sometimes produces, that she was the kind of person who holds things together by refusing to acknowledge that they are falling apart. The clock read 58 minutes when the evacuation of the outer ring was complete. 341 people packed into 4 agricultural galleries that smelled like wet soil and chlorophyll and recycled air, and the sharp chemical edge of CO2 concentration rising beyond comfort. The plant systems were producing oxygen, but 341 people breathing harder than normal, because they were frightened and confined, and because their bodies were already compensating for the rising carbon dioxide, consumed oxygen faster than the growth beds could produce it. Venice ran the numbers on her operations console. She factored in the plant oxygen production rates, the remaining atmosphere in the reserve tanks, the CO2 absorption capacity of the soil beds, the average metabolic output of the population at elevated stress levels, and the rate at which the cascade was continuing to degrade the outer ring atmosphere, which was still leaking into the central hub through imperfect seals. The number she arrived at was 104 minutes, 14 minutes better than the original 90, still not enough. The CFS Pellerstrand was still 11 hours away. I was standing in the doorway of Agricultural Gallery 3, the largest, holding 160 people, when the communications officer spoke. Her name was Tarith Saul. She was 23 years old, recently graduated from the Convocation's communications training program on Vel Andris, assigned to Rithara Station as her first frontier posting. She had been monitoring every frequency band the station could receive since the cascade began, because that is what a communications officer does during an emergency. She listens. She had heard the Frontier Authority's 11-hour estimate. She had heard nothing else. Until now. Saul said, in a voice so carefully controlled that I almost missed the tremor underneath it. Commander, there is a transmission incoming on the chapel band frequency. The agricultural gallery went quiet. Not silent, 341 people cannot be silent, even when they are frightened and breathing bad air in a room that smells like soil and fear. But the conversations nearest to us stopped, and a small, hollow space opened in the noise where Saul's words sat like something no one wanted to touch. The chapel band frequency had never received an incoming transmission in the 63-year operational history of Rithara Station. Not once. It was a broadcast-only channel, outbound, always outbound. We sent hymns and prayers into the void. The void did not answer. That was the fundamental premise of the system. The entire theological framework of the chapel band service rested on the understanding that the frequencies were one-directional, a voice speaking into the dark for the benefit of the speaker, not the listener. Something in the dark had been listening, and now it was answering. Saul read the incoming transmission aloud. Her voice held steady, Her hands shook on the console panel visibly, and she did not try to hide it. Rithara Station. This is Terran Commonwealth Vessel TMS Constant Regard, Convoy Lead for Task Group Arden. We have received your distress broadcast on our emergency monitoring band via frequency overlap with your Chapel Band Channel 7741. We are inbound your position at best speed with atmospheric remediation capability. Estimated arrival 31 minutes. We are accompanied by medical and engineering support. Please confirm your current atmospheric parameters and population count so we can configure equipment in transit. Constant regard out. Agricultural Gallery 3 was silent. 341 people breathing air that was killing them by degrees, and the room was silent. I did not know who the Terran Commonwealth was. I need to state that plainly, because the convocation investigators who questioned me 7 weeks later did not believe it. The convocation's formal diplomatic relationship with the Terran Commonwealth, such as it existed, was handled exclusively by the diplomatic enclave on Solith Prime, 700 light-years from Rithara Station. I am a frontier chaplain on a mining colony in a sector that the convocation's central government considers barely worth resupplying on schedule. I knew that humans existed. I knew they had vessels. I knew, vaguely, that they occupied a region of space that was the subject of some ongoing territorial discussion at the diplomatic level. I could not have named a single human vessel. I could not have identified a single human official. I could not have pointed at a star chart and shown you where they lived. They were a footnote on page 1143. They were a frequency overlap that nobody had flagged, and they were 31 minutes away from saving every person on the station. I looked around Agricultural Gallery 3. 160 people stood or sat or leaned against the walls, breathing air that tasted wrong, watching the clock on the operations feed count down toward a number that had been death 20 seconds ago and was now possibly, impossibly, something else. A miner near the far wall was holding his wife's hand. A group of technicians sat together in a tight cluster, not speaking, staring at the console where Saul had read the transmission. A child, not one I had carried, a boy of maybe 8, had pressed his face against the observation window and was looking out into the void as though he could already see them coming. Venice gave no speech. She made no announcement about what the transmission meant. She simply began communicating with the inbound vessels in the same procedural tone she had used for everything since the cascade began, because Dorath Venice understood that hope, given prematurely to frighten people, can be as dangerous as despair. She would not tell them they were saved until the ships had docked and the equipment was running and the air was clean. Until then, she would work. Venice responded to the transmission. Her voice was the same flat, controlled, procedural instrument she had used since the cascade began. She did not waver, did not accelerate, did not add any inflection that might indicate to 341 frightened colonists that something extraordinary had just occurred. But I was standing close enough to see her hand grip the edge of the operations console, and I saw the tendons in her wrist stand rigid against her skin, and I understood that the discipline holding her voice steady was the same discipline that had held this station together for 9 years. She sent our atmospheric parameters, current composition, degradation rate, cascade progression, section-by-section readings. She sent the population count. She sent the triage data on the 14 colonists already showing CO2 toxicity symptoms. She sent the cascade timeline from origin to present. She sent everything, quickly and cleanly, in standard convocation data format, because Dorath Venice did not know how to send data any other way, and would not have compromised her standards for a species she had never communicated with before. The constant regard responded in 11 seconds. 11 seconds to receive convocation format data, parse a data structure they had presumably never encountered in real-time operations, and formulate a coherent reply. They confirmed receipt. They adjusted their arrival estimate to 28 minutes based on the updated coordinate lock. They informed us that their atmospheric equipment was being configured during transit to match the specific atmospheric composition and degradation pattern Venise had described. And then they asked a question that made Venise pause. A pause so brief that no one in the gallery noticed it except me, because I was watching her face. Rithara Station, constant regard. Do you have individuals requiring immediate medical intervention upon our arrival? We are carrying a field hospital rated for 200 beds with full xenobiological capability, including convocation species respiratory support protocols. Please advise triage priority if applicable. Constant regard standing by. A field hospital, rated for 200 beds, with xenobiological capability, including respiratory support protocols specific to our species. We had asked the Convocation Frontier Authority for replacement filter cartridges, a supply hauler carrying standard maintenance parts. We had not asked for a field hospital. We had not asked for medical support. We had not asked for anything from the Terran Commonwealth. We had not asked for anything from anyone except the bureaucracy that had built this station and staffed it and undersupplied it and told us, when the air turned bad, that help was 11 hours away. A species I could not name was bringing a 200-bed hospital to a station that had asked its own government for air filters. Venise sent the triage data. 14 colonists symptomatic, 3 children under 6. 1 critical, Prelate Nath Vesey, retired circuit chaplain, 40 years of service to the Convocation, who had come to Rithara to spend his remaining years near the frontier he had loved his entire career, and whose pre-existing respiratory condition made him vulnerable to CO2 concentration levels that healthy adults could tolerate for hours. Venise flagged him as Priority 1. The constant regard acknowledged the triage data. Then a second voice came on the chapel band frequency, a different vessel, a different call sign, the same calm professional register. Rithara Station, this is TMS Halcyon Bridge, medical support vessel, Task Group Arden. We are carrying atmospheric scrubbing units rated for station-scale deployment, supplemental oxygen reserves for extended operations, and a medical team with xenobiological specialists carrying convocation species physiology profiles, including pediatric and geriatric respiratory protocols. We will begin atmospheric remediation upon docking. Please designate docking bays and provide internal pressure differential readings for all affected sections. Halcyon Bridge, out. A second ship, a medical support vessel, carrying atmospheric scrubbers rated for an entire station, supplemental oxygen. A medical team that already had our species physiology profiles loaded, including protocols for our children and our elderly. As though someone, somewhere in the Terran Commonwealth's logistics chain, had decided years ago that this specific capability should be available in this specific region of space, for an emergency that had never happened before. Venise designated docking bays, Bay 4 for the Constant Regard, Bay 9 for the Halcyon Bridge. Her voice did not change, her hand on the console did not move. But Saul, at her station, turned to look at me across the gallery, and the expression on her face is the one I will carry for the rest of my life. The look of a young woman who grew up believing that the chapel band frequencies were one-directional, that prayers went out and nothing came back, and who had just heard something come back. I went back to the chapel band room. I am not entirely certain why. Perhaps because it was my room and the transmitters were my equipment, and the frequency that had carried my panicked, badly formatted distress call into a monitoring band I had never heard of was still open, still broadcasting, still bridging 2 civilizations that had never directly communicated. Perhaps because I needed to see the proof on my own console, the transmission log, the timestamps, the evidence that what had just happened was real and not the kind of hallucination that carbon dioxide toxicity can produce. The console showed the broadcast log in cold, clear characters. My distress call, transmitted on channel 7741 at 14:07 station time. The response from the Constant Regard, received on the same channel at 14:18. 11 minutes elapsed. The round-trip signal propagation delay at 37 light minutes was approximately 8 minutes. That meant the monitoring station at Arden Point had received my signal at approximately 14:11, and they had begun their response, mobilized a convoy, plotted a course, configured atmospheric equipment, composed a hail by 14:14. 3 minutes. Between receiving a funeral hymn frequency carrying a malformed distress call from a species they had no treaty with, no alliance with, no formal diplomatic relationship with, no mutual defense obligation to, no reason in any legal or political or strategic framework to assist, and deciding to come. 3 minutes to decide that someone dying on the wrong frequency was still someone dying. I pulled up the frequency allocation chart, the one I maintain as part of my weekly duties, the one that shows which channels carry which content. Channel 7741 was listed as hymn carrier, lament cycle, deprecated pre-Reformation band, no known active receivers. No known active receivers. That designation had been accurate for 63 years. It was no longer accurate. Somewhere at the edge of our broadcast range, there had been a receiver all along, staffed and funded and maintained by a species that considered our funeral hymns worth listening to even when they were just background noise. I checked the other channels. My distress call had gone out on all of them, every port, every frequency, every band the array could reach. The convocation channels showed acknowledgement from the Frontier Authority, the same acknowledgement Venice had already received. Help 11 hours away. The deprecated bands showed no response. The test frequencies showed no response. Only channel 7741 had answered. The one frequency I had been told carried nothing, but prayers to the dead had been the one that saved us. The operations feed updated. 39 minutes of viable atmosphere, and somewhere in the dark between our station and a research platform I had never heard of, a convoy was burning toward us at maximum speed, carrying equipment configured specifically for our emergency, because a monitoring officer named Ferris had heard a funeral hymn turn into a distress call and had not hesitated. I sat at the console and stared at the timestamps and tried to process what kind of standing orders produce a 3-minute response to a signal on a funeral band from a civilization that does not formally acknowledge your existence. What kind of monitoring protocol treats hymn bleed on a deprecated frequency as potential evidence that someone is in trouble? What kind of organizational culture builds a system where the default answer to a stranger's distress call, received on a frequency that was never meant to carry it, from a people who did not send it to you, formatted incorrectly, addressed to no one, is not to verify jurisdiction, not to escalate for authorization, not to file a report and wait for guidance, but to go? The countdown on the operations feed read 39 minutes of viable atmosphere when the Constant Regard docked. I felt it before I heard it. A low structural vibration transmitted through the station's hull and into the deck plates and through the frame of my chair, a deep resonance that I felt in my teeth and in the bones of my hands. The docking clamps engaged with a precise, heavy sound, not the sound of a convocation vessel docking, which is lighter, more tentative, the sound of standardized equipment meeting standardized ports. This was heavier, more deliberate. The sound of a ship that was built to dock quickly and firmly, because the people it was built for arrive at places where every second of docking delay is a second someone is dying. Pressure equalized. The airlock in Bay 4 cycled, and they came through. Not in military formation, in working formation. The kind of coordinated movement that comes from teams who have drilled together hundreds of times and who no longer need verbal coordination. They know where each person goes, what each person carries, what the sequence is. 3 people carrying atmospheric processing units that were taller than I am and already powered, already cycling, their intake fans spinning before they cleared the airlock. Behind them, 2 more with portable oxygen concentrators on wheeled frames, cables neatly coiled, intake adapters already fitted with convocation standard port connectors. They had configured the adapters during transit, 31 minutes of flight time, used to fabricate the interface components needed to connect their equipment to our infrastructure. Behind them, the medical team, 6 people with equipment cases stacked on a gravity-assist dolly, and a portable triage station in modular panels that they carried like people carrying furniture they had assembled and disassembled 1,000 times. They moved through the airlock, through the corridor, into Agricultural Gallery 3, and they assembled the triage station in 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I was watching the clock on the operations feed while I watched them work, and the gap between the first panel touching the deck and the last diagnostic screen illuminating was exactly 4 minutes. They moved like people who had done this before, in many places, for many species. Many times there was no hesitation, no confusion about which corridor to take or where the galleries were. They had studied our station schematics during transit. No ceremony, no introductions. They did not announce themselves. They did not request permission. 341 colonists watched them enter. 341 people who had spent the last hour breathing increasingly toxic air in agricultural galleries that smelled like soil and chlorophyll and fear, watched a species they had never met walk through the airlock carrying equipment they had never seen, wearing uniforms marked with insignia they could not read, speaking a language they did not understand. And none of them flinched. None of them moved back. Because the equipment was already running, already producing clean air, and because the people carrying it moved with the certainty of those who know exactly what they are doing and why they are there. They assessed the environment in the first 30 seconds, exchanged brief words in a language I did not understand, and began. A woman in a gray utility uniform, no rank insignia I could interpret, no decoration, no medals, nothing but a name patch on her left chest that read ODERA and a tool belt around her waist that looked like it contained more specialized equipment than our entire maintenance bay, walked directly to Venny's and said, in accented but perfectly competent convocation standard, "Commander, I'm Chief Odera, Atmospheric Remediation Lead, Constant Regard. Your Cascade origin is Bay 16, which access corridor?" Venny's pointed. Odera nodded once, turned, and led her atmospheric team out of the gallery and into the failed bay without another word. No briefing requested. No delay. She had all the data she needed because her ship had received it during transit, and she had read it during the approach, and she was not a person who asked questions she already knew the answers to. I followed her team at a distance, not because I could help, I could not, but because I needed to see. Bay 16's processor was a wreck. The primary filtration assembly had seized, the pressure regulation valve had failed open, and the secondary backup unit had overloaded trying to compensate. Our maintenance team had been scheduling a full overhaul for 3 months. The Convocation's Regional Maintenance Authority had declined the request twice on budget grounds. Odera's team assessed the damage in under 2 minutes. They set up their atmospheric processing units in a semicircle around the failed processor. 3 portable units, each one humming with a steady mechanical rhythm that was different from the sound our equipment made, deeper and more constant, like the breathing of something large and patient. One of her team members, a tall man with close-cropped hair and hands that moved with the practiced precision of someone who works with dangerous systems, connected the units to our ventilation manifold using adapter fittings that I recognized as Convocation Standard. They had brought Convocation Standard adapter fittings. They had brought equipment designed to connect to our infrastructure. In Agricultural Gallery 3, the colonists were watching the medical team work. I came back from Bay 16 and stood in the doorway, and looked at 341 people who were still breathing bad air but who were breathing, and who were watching 6 human medics move through the gallery with quiet, methodical efficiency, treating the symptomatic colonists one at a time, checking vital signs with instruments that they held against convocation skin as naturally as if they had been designed for it. Oshpelari, the maintenance worker who had carried 7 children during the evacuation, was sitting against the wall of the gallery with his legs stretched out and his head tipped back, watching the humans. His expression was not gratitude, not yet. It was the bewildered stillness of a man trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had understood about the universe 30 minutes ago. 30 minutes ago, the galaxy's only potential source of help was 11 hours away. Now there were humans in his station, and they had brought equipment that fit his pipes. The atmospheric processing units they deployed in Bay 16 began cycling within 6 minutes of being placed. I know this because I heard the change. A subtle shift in the air pressure in the gallery, barely perceptible, like the difference between standing in a sealed room and standing in a room where someone has cracked open a window. The operations feed showed the first measurable improvement in atmospheric composition, 7 minutes after the constant regards equipment went active. 7 minutes. The cascade had been degrading our air for over an hour. In 7 minutes, the human equipment reversed the trend. The Halcyon Bridge docked at Bay 9 7 minutes after the constant regard. Its docking vibration was softer, gentler, a controlled contact that I would later understand was intentional. A medical vessel, I learned, is designed to dock with minimal structural impact because the patients it serves are already suffering and the last thing they need is to be shaken. They brought more. They brought atmospheric scrubbing units rated for a station 3 times Rithara's size. Heavy industrial units that their engineering teams bolted to our ventilation manifolds in under 50 minutes, working with precision tools and convocation-compatible fasteners that they had fabricated during transit. They brought a xenobiological medical team of 6 specialists who began treating the 14 symptomatic colonists within 9 minutes of stepping through the airlock, working from physiology profiles that included convocation respiratory benchmarks, pharmaceutical compatibility matrices, pediatric dosing tables calibrated to our species' metabolic rates, and geriatric care protocols that specifically addressed the kind of pre-existing respiratory condition that Prelate Noth Vesey suffered from. They had those protocols because someone in the Terran Commonwealth's Medical Logistics Division had decided, at some point in the past, I do not know when, I do not know who, that any Terran medical vessel operating within monitoring range of convocation space should carry a complete medical capability package for convocation species, not because there was a treaty requiring it, not because there was a precedent, because someone had decided that being near people who might need help meant being ready to help those specific people. They brought food, field rations pre-packaged, military-grade, heated, in containers designed for rapid distribution, enough for 500 people. We had 341. They brought enough for 500 because, as I would learn during the investigation, their logistics protocol assumed that any population in atmospheric distress would include individuals who had not eaten during the crisis and who would require caloric intake to support physiological recovery. They planned for the margin. They brought more than was needed because their system was built on the principle that arriving with too much is not waste. It is the minimum standard of care. The children ate first. Nobody ordered this. The human medics simply began distributing rations to the children in the gallery before moving to the adults, as though the priority was self-evident and did not require discussion. Miri Voss, the 4-year-old who had clung to my robe and had not cried, accepted a warm ration packet with both hands and ate it sitting, cross-legged on the floor of the gallery, while watching the human medical team work on Prelate Vesey with an expression of grave, focused curiosity. One of the medics, A young man with dark hair and steady hands noticed the scrape on her knee, a small abrasion she had gotten during the evacuation, and knelt beside her and cleaned it and applied a small adhesive bandage with a care and precision that was identical to the care and precision he had applied to Vessie's respiratory treatment moments before. Miri accepted the bandage with the solemnity of a person receiving something important. She touched it with one finger, looked up at the medic and said nothing. He said nothing. He patted her shoulder once, stood up and went back to work. The food distribution was the moment that broke something in me. Not the atmospheric equipment, that was technical, professional, the kind of help that could be quantified and explained. Not the medical treatment, that was urgent, necessary, the kind of response that any civilization capable of interstellar travel should be able to provide. But the food. They brought warm food to people who had not asked for food. They brought it in quantities that exceeded what was needed by 50%, because their planning assumed that people in crisis might be hungry, and that hungry people recover more slowly. They distributed it without being asked to distribute it. They heated it before distributing it, because warm food provides more comfort than cold food, and because someone in their logistics system had decided that comfort is a component of emergency response. I watched a human medic, the one who had bandaged Miri Voss's knee, hand a warm ration packet to an elderly mining foreman named Keleth Dren, who had worked in Rithara's extraction bays for 22 years, and who was sitting in the gallery with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his expression locked in the grim stoicism that frontier miners cultivate against every kind of uncertainty. Keleth took the packet. He held it in both hands. He looked at the human. The human nodded once, said something in accented convocation, standard that I did not quite hear, and moved on. Keleth opened the packet and ate, slowly at first, then steadily. When he finished, he folded the packaging neatly, as precisely as he folds his equipment logs at the end of each shift, and placed it on the floor beside him, and he sat there looking at the folded packaging for a long time, and his expression had changed from stoicism to something I did not have a name for. I think the word is wonder, but not the bright, sharp wonder of discovery. The slow, quiet wonder of a man who has lived his entire life on a frontier station that his own government struggles to resupply on schedule, who has just been fed warm food by a stranger from a civilization he did not know was listening to his station's funeral prayers. Then the third ship docked. I did not know about the third ship until I felt the vibration through the hull, heavier than the Halcyon Bridge, a deeper structural resonance, the docking signature of an engineering vessel built for industrial-scale repair work. Bay 22, on the far side of the station. Nobody had announced it on the chapel band frequency. Nobody had requested it. Nobody on Rithara Station had asked for an engineering vessel, because nobody on Rithara Station had known that engineering support was something the species answering our funeral hymn frequency was capable of providing. The TMS Sable Meridian Engineering Support Vessel, Task Group Arden, 11 crew. They came through the airlock in Bay 22 carrying tools and components and portable fabrication units, and they went directly to the failed atmospheric processors in Bays 12 through 20, and they began repairing them. Not bypassing them, not applying temporary patches or jury-rigged workarounds that would hold for a few hours until the convocation supply hauler arrived, repairing them permanently, with replacement components that they had fabricated during the 31-minute transit from Arden Point, manufactured from stock materials aboard their ship, using a fabrication unit that was capable of producing atmospheric processor components compatible with 4 different species station architectures, including ours. They had the schematics. They had our station type's processor model in their engineering database. They had the material specifications. They had the tolerance parameters. They had everything required to fabricate the parts we needed, because someone in the Terran Commonwealth's engineering logistics system had decided that a support vessel operating in this region should carry the manufacturing capability to repair convocation equipment for an emergency that had never occurred and that no one had planned for except them. The Sable Meridian's 11-person crew repaired 9 atmospheric processors in 6 hours. They worked methodically, bay by bay, documenting each repair, testing each processor against specification before moving to the next, leaving behind equipment that was not just functional but better calibrated than it had been before the cascade. We had asked our own government for replacement filter cartridges. We had been told to wait 14 hours. The Terran Commonwealth, who heard a funeral prayer on a deprecated frequency that overlapped with their emergency band, by a technical coincidence documented in a footnote that nobody had read, they sent us 3 ships. Atmospheric remediation equipment rated for a station 3 times our size. A 200-bed field hospital with a medical team carrying our species' complete physiology in their database. Warm food for 500. An engineering crew that fabricated our replacement parts during a 31-minute flight and repaired our processors in 6 hours with components built to specification from our own schematics. We did not ask them for any of it. We did not know they existed as a presence capable of answering. I broadcast a distress call on a funeral hymn frequency because I was a chaplain standing in front of a transmitter, and I did not know what else to do, and they heard it on a band that overlapped with our chapel frequencies by a footnote nobody had read in 41 years, and they came in 31 minutes, and they brought everything. The atmospheric crisis was functionally resolved within 4 hours of the constant regards arrival. The air in the galleries stabilized first, then the central hub, then the outer ring as the repaired processors came back online one by one. All 14 symptomatic colonists recovered fully within 12 hours. The 3 children recovered fastest, as children do. Prelate Nath Vesey, who had been the most critical case of blood oxygen dropping, respiratory rate erratic, consciousness fading by the time the Halcyon Bridges team reached him, was stable within 90 minutes of treatment. They had the correct medication for his specific condition, not a general-purpose respiratory support drug adapted for alien physiology. The correct medication, specific to his condition, at the correct dosage for his age and body weight and species metabolic parameters. They had it because their pharmaceutical inventory included it. They had it because someone had decided it should be there. Vesey opened his eyes while the medic was adjusting his oxygen flow, and the first thing he said, in a voice that was weak but perfectly clear, was, "Who are these people?" The medic, a woman with short gray hair and an expression of clinical focus, answered him in accented convocation standard without looking up from her work. "Terran Commonwealth Medical Corps, sir. Try not to talk." Vesey looked at her for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and breathed cleanly, steadily, for the first time in hours, and said nothing else. I spoke with Chief Odera near the end, when the crisis was resolved and her teams were packing their equipment for departure. She was in Bay 16, supervising the final recalibration of the primary processor, the one that had started the cascade, now rebuilt by the Sable Meridian's engineers and running smoother than it had in years. I approached her because I had been carrying a question in my chest since the first transmission arrived on channel 7741, and I needed to give it words. "How did you hear us?" I asked. She looked at me. She had a tired face, not the tiredness of this single emergency, a deeper tiredness, the kind that accumulates over years of arriving at places where the air is failing or the structure is breaking or the people are frightened, doing the work, packing up, and leaving for the next one. Competent and tired and entirely without pretension or self-regard. "Arden Point picked up your broadcast on our emergency band 7, she said. "Funeral frequency, but the data packet was structured like a distress call. Atmospheric parameters, population count, time to critical. Our monitoring officer, Lieutenant Ferris, flagged it as a probable genuine emergency at a Convocation Frontier installation. She routed it to Convoy Command. "We did not send it to you," I said. "I know," she said. The frequency was a chapel band carrier, channel 7741. It is meant for hymns, for prayers, for the dead. "I know," she said again, with the patience of someone who has had this conversation before, not this exact one, but ones like it, conversations with people on the other side of an emergency who cannot quite believe that the help came from where it came from. "Your chapel band frequencies overlap with our emergency band 7. It has been in our monitoring protocols for approximately 40 years. We receive him bleed every few weeks. Our systems log it, flag it as non-emergency, and file it. This time the signal was not a hymn. You responded in 3 minutes. 3 minutes from receiving a malformed signal on a funeral band from a species you have no obligation to. Signal delay was 4 minutes each way. We initiated our response within 3 minutes of receipt. That is correct. But you had no treaty with us, no agreement, no defense pact, no diplomatic channel, no reason." She stopped working. She set down the calibration tool she had been holding, a small precision instrument, the kind of tool that requires steady hands, and she looked at me directly, and her expression was the thing I have spent 7 weeks trying to find the correct word for in the Convocation's language and have not succeeded. It was not pity. It was not pride. It was not the satisfaction of someone who has performed a service and expects recognition. It was not warmth, exactly, though it was not cold. It was something that I think might be harder than all of those things. The look of a professional who has been asked why she responded to a distress call and who does not understand the question, because the question, to her, contains a premise that does not exist. The premise that there was a choice. "Chaplain," she said, "someone was dying, the frequency does not matter." She picked up her calibration tool and went back to work. I stood in Bay 16 for a while after that, listening to the atmospheric processor cycle, the steady, rhythmic hum of equipment that had been dead 4 hours ago and was now running on components fabricated by a species that heard our funeral hymns as background noise and came anyway. The hours between the atmospheric stabilization and the Terran convoy's departure were quiet in a way that frontier emergencies rarely are. Usually, the aftermath of a crisis is filled with noise, recriminations, stress reactions, procedural disputes, blame seeking its level. Rithara Station was quiet. People sat in the galleries and the corridors and watched the human engineering teams work on the processors, and the human medics check and recheck the recovering patients, and the human logistics crew sweep the station's ventilation system with diagnostic equipment that mapped every duct and every filter and every connection. They worked for 14 hours straight, the 3 crews of the 3 ships, and they did not ask for rest, and they did not ask for thanks, and they did not explain themselves to anyone who did not ask. Saul sat at her communications console the entire time, monitoring the chapel band frequency. Nothing else came through. Only silence and the faint background hum of a funeral hymn carrier that had been broadcasting into the void for 63 years and had, for 31 minutes on one day, carried something else. I asked her at one point what she was listening for. She said she did not know, but she did not stop listening. The CFS Velen Ark, the Convocation Frontier Authority's supply hauler, carrying the replacement filter cartridges we had requisitioned 6 weeks earlier, arrived 9 hours and 14 minutes after the Terran Commonwealth's 3 ships had resolved the crisis, repaired our processors, treated our sick and elderly and children, fed our people, and begun packing their equipment for departure. The hauler captain contacted Venice and asked if she still required the filter cartridges. Venice said yes. She accepted the shipment without comment. She did not mention the humans to the hauler captain, not because she was ungrateful. Dorath Venice has never been ungrateful for anything in a life spent holding frontier stations together with discipline and stubbornness. She said nothing because she did not yet have the precise words for what had happened, and she is not a woman who speaks imprecisely. She filed her after-action report 3 days later. It was 11 pages long. It described the cascade, the evacuation, the atmospheric failure timeline, the convocation's response, and the Terran Commonwealth's response, in the same flat procedural language she uses for everything. The last line of the report, which the investigators later told me they had read several times, was, "The responding Terran vessels departed at 22:40 station time. No invoice was received. No reciprocal obligation was stated. No conditions were attached." The investigation lasted 7 weeks. The Convocation Signal Authority reviewed my broadcast in comprehensive detail. They documented the 3 formatting errors. They documented the unauthorized use of chapel band frequencies for non-hymn, non-ritual transmission, which technically violated Signal Authority Regulation 4712. They documented that the frequency overlap with Terran Commonwealth Emergency Monitoring Band 7 had been present in their own frequency allocation manual for 41 years without being flagged as a potential communication pathway, a security concern, or an item requiring chaplain notification. They did not discipline me. The legal review could not determine whether the regulation I had technically violated, unauthorized use of a chapel band frequency, outweighed the general emergency regulation that requires all station personnel to use every available means to preserve life during a declared atmospheric emergency. The matter was referred to the Frontier Division's Legal Review Board. As of this writing, they are still deliberating. I am still the broadcast chaplain at Rithara Station. The chapel band transmitters are still broadcasting on the same deprecated frequencies they have used for 63 years, including channel 7741, which still overlaps with Terran Commonwealth Emergency Monitoring Band 7. The Convocation Signal Authority has not changed the frequency allocation. They have not closed the overlap. They have, however, added an annotation to page 1143, subsection 9, paragraph 4 of their Master Frequency Allocation Manual, acknowledging that the overlap constitutes a functional emergency communication pathway and recommending, not requiring, recommending, that Frontier chaplains be informed of its existence. I was the first chaplain informed. I expect I will not be the last. On my console in the chapel band room, next to the hymn cycle schedule and the frequency use log and the weekly transmitter maintenance checklist, there is a small card. Chief Odera left it the morning her convoy departed, placed precisely between the hymn log and the frequency chart, centered, as though it belonged there and had always belonged there, and had simply been waiting for someone to put it in its place. It has a frequency written on it in neat, precise handwriting, a direct contact frequency for the Terran Commonwealth's emergency monitoring station at Arden Point, and below the frequency, 2 words. Just call. I have not used it. I hope I never need to. But every morning when I sit down at my console to cue the day's first hymn, I check that the card is still there, that the frequency is still legible, that the ink has not faded, that the small, quiet connection to the species who heard a funeral prayer on a deprecated frequency and responded with 3 ships and a field hospital and warm food for 500 and fabricated replacement parts, and a medical team that already knew how to treat our children, that it is still 1 transmission away. The Lament of Anthari Vel is still in the broadcast queue, paused at the 11-minute mark. I have never finished playing it. It is a prayer for the dead who cannot find their way home. No one on Rithara Station needed that prayer. Everyone found their way home, not through the door any of us expected, and not because anyone we knew was listening, but because someone we had never met was, and they did not need a reason.